Hello, everyone. My name's Michelle Ciappa, and I'm the Development and Special Projects Manager here at BMES. And we want to thank you today for joining us for Regulatory Science for BME Certificate Part 1, Why We Should Care About Medical Product Regulation webinar. Today, and participation in both the virtual webinar and the in-person workshop that you all signed up for at BMES 2025 annual meeting is going to fulfill the requirement for completing the BMES Certificate of Participation program that's on regulatory science for BME. The certificate program is designed for industry professionals who want to expand their knowledge of regulatory science. Through the webinar today, feel free to submit questions as you think of them and as we go, and through the Q&A box, and we'll make sure to address your questions at the end of the webinar. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Wendy Brown today, Director of Regulatory and Clinical Affairs at Cartledge Incorporated, here to provide more information about regulatory science and give the context for the modern regulatory framework. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Wendy to begin.
Thank you, Michelle. Give me 1 second to get my slides going. I have two screens, so I have to shuffle some windows first. Okay. Michelle, just confirm you can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for joining me today. It's great to see that so many people have registered and actually are interested in this topic because I care about it a lot, and hopefully by the end of this, you will too. So as Michelle said, I am Wendy Brown, the Director of Regulatory and Clinical Affairs for Cartledge Inc. But first I'll introduce myself. I have a very traditional academic background. I have a bachelor's degree in biomedical engineering from Georgia Tech. And then I did a PhD in biomedical engineering from UC Davis. The focus of my PhD was on cartilage tissue engineering. And then after I finished that, I did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California in Irvine, also on cartilage tissue engineering. With my PI and several of my colleagues, I co-founded a startup company called Cartledge Inc. in 2019 to commercialize the technologies that we were developing in the lab. But in trying to do so, we realized that we knew very little about the regulation of a biological cartilage implant that was not a metal and plastic device and not like a small molecule drug. And so because of that, I got a master's degree in regulatory science from the University of Southern California in 2022. And truly, it opened my eyes to the possibilities of what our technologies can do, what sorts of studies we should be conducting, and just why everybody should care about regulation in general, because everybody uses medical products in their daily lives, and we should know how these things are regulated. So right now in my duties as the Director of Regulatory and Clinical Affairs, I'm overseeing the regulatory aspects of preclinical animal studies to support an application to the FDA to begin clinical trials for our engineered cartilage implant to treat damaged jaw cartilage. I also want to preface this whole session by saying I would like you all to watch this as if you're watching a very interesting talk on the History Channel. I hope that you are interested and engaged and like, wow, that was really interesting. I'm not, my goal is for people to not take feverish notes the whole time, but there are several key things listed here that I would like you to take away. And hopefully those will be obvious throughout the presentation because I literally have gold stars next to these items. So those key takeaways are the fundamental terms that are involved in regulation, the foundational laws that empower the FDA to regulate medical products, the regulatory philosophy and how that has shifted over the course of sort of our modern history of regulation in the United States, and the difference between laws, regulations, and guidance documents. And as I said, this will be very obvious along the way.
And I just popped in for a moment. I'm John Falcioni. I'm the executive director of BMES, and I just wanted to thank Wendy for doing this really important webinar for us here. Not only the webinar, but also the workshop at our annual meeting in a couple of weeks. So thank you, Wendy. This is a really not only important for our members, but also something of great interest. And it's something that we're told that doesn't always get taught in universities. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And that's all I wanted to say. I'll pop off right now. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I really appreciate BMES's interest in this topic, and I think it is an area that all of us can learn more about and uh, be more knowledgeable in general. I think it's going to be very beneficial for everyone's research. Um, so
Terrific.
I think everybody sort of knows what the FDA is, but just so we're all on the same page, we'll start with the mission statement. The FDA, or the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, is a federal science-based law enforcement agency mandated to protect public health and safety by assuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, medical devices, our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. So that's actually quite broad, and it includes a lot of different types of products that maybe as biomedical engineers we're not aware of. For example, veterinary drugs, food, cosmetics. But hopefully you will see over the course of the presentation why the FDA does have jurisdiction over all of those different categories. Let's start with a little bit of a history lesson. So in the late 1700s into the 1800s, the United States was undergoing the Industrial Revolution. Industries were greatly changing. Cities were popping up. We have interstate commerce now because of the invention of trains and the establishment of the first railroad in North America. So things are really changing from localized agricultural life to industrialized factories in cities. And you can see the evolution of medical products of the time following these cultural and scientific trends. We've all heard of snake oil. I think, that term is still in our vernacular today to describe something that's just absolutely fake and doesn't have any value. But snake oil was actually a real fraudulent medical product that was being sold at the time in the 1700s. And you can, as I said, see these snake oils evolve over time following the science and technology that was being developed. So in the 1870s, we have electric streetlights introduced. And similarly, we have harnesses electropathic belts. There are actually quite a lot of examples of electrified belts and things for your body that overcome weakness. It's a boon to sufferers. Scientifically constructed, it cures debility and cures hysteria. I'm not sure how comfortable literally electrifying your organs would be, but snake oil of the time. In 1877, we have the Interstate Commerce Act. As I said, goods are moving more state to state because of industrialization, and this is actually important for how the FDA will regulate the sale of medical products in the future. In the late 1800s, we have the discovery of radioactivity and the discovery of radium and polonium by Marie Sklodowska, also known as Marie Curie and Pierre Curie. And again, our products follow that technology. So we have radioactive cosmetics from France, So Radia, with this beautiful glowing woman. We think of snake oil in all of these forms, though, as at best useless, but at worst, they're actually dangerous because they're unregulated. And a really tragic example of this is Ebenezer Byers, who was a 20-something-year-old healthy young man, championship amateur golfer, who suffered an arm injury that was not healing well. And his doctor recommended that he drink radioactive water, this Radiator, to help him heal. And over the course of 3 years, he consumed something like 1,400 bottles of radioactive water, and ultimately died. This is a bit of a jump scare, but he had to have his entire lower jaw removed and most of his upper jaw because of the damage of this radiation. So at worst, these products actually are dangerous, and they're at the time just totally unregulated and out there for anybody to get their hands on. Also, at the time, we have scandals associated with food. In the 1850s, this is known as the swill milk scandal. So, oftentimes, distilleries that made alcohol had dairies associated with them because they would have this stuff called swill or spent grain that was a byproduct of the distillation process that they had a lot of and they wanted to make use of. So they would establish dairies next to these distilleries and feed the cows this spent grain or swill, and then produce horrible milk of horrible quality. These cows lived in horrible conditions. They were severely malnourished because all they were eating was this swill, and they produced a quote sickly bluish milk. And then this milk was further adulterated with things like plaster of Paris, starch, eggs, molasses to try to make it look more palatable and appealing. And horribly and ironically, it was marketed as pure country milk. But this milk was so horribly contaminated that 8,000 infants died from drinking this swill milk in the late 1800s. Also, around that time, the United States was embroiled in the Spanish-American War, which they were really poorly prepared for at the time. And so they needed to get food to the troops, and they signed a contract with basically the lowest bidder to supply tinned beef to the soldiers. However, the meat that arrived to the troops was poorly preserved, chemically adulterated with things attempting to preserve it, spoiled and toxic. And General Nelson Miles actually called it embalmed beef because it was so bad. Importantly, Theodore Roosevelt, who at the time was a soldier during this war, had firsthand experience with this embalmed beef, and he has a very important role in the formation of sort of the modern regulatory framework, as we'll see in a couple slides. And ultimately, this contaminated beef actually killed twice as many men in the Spanish-American War as combat did. In 1902, because, as I said, America was industrializing and people are moving to cities for jobs, the food had to travel farther and needed to be preserved so that it would last longer for that trip. So it was being attempted to be preserved with things like formaldehyde, borax, and salicylic acid. And nobody really knew what the dangers were of preserving food in this manner or how much preservative people were consuming. So as I said, in 1902, the hygienic table trials were conducted, which are largely regarded to be the first truly controlled clinical trials. They were run by Harvey Wiley, who was basically a farm boy who became a chemist and knew how the quality of food was shifting from consuming locally grown and produced food and dairy to more industrialized food. And he formed this poison squad of healthy young men who tested chemical preservatives on themselves. Here are some pictures. You can see Harvey Wiley here with his poison squad and then them eating in their dining room. And the sign was in their dining room, "None but the brave can eat the fare." So as I said, this was really regarded as the first controlled clinical trial testing things like these preservatives. And I don't know if you guys remember the beef, it's what's for dinner ad, but it's borax in this case is what's for dinner. Still in the early 1900s, in 1905, Upton Sinclair published a fictional novel, but it was based on Chicago's Packingtown district. And it depicted the appalling working conditions of this Packingtown district. And that's what he aimed to highlight was the horrible plight of these workers. And the novel indeed enraged the public, but for a different reason. They were horrified at the potential contamination of their food. So a now President Theodore Roosevelt, had experienced with this embalmed beef from the Spanish-American War and was horrified. So he formed a special commission to investigate these slaughterhouses. When the report came out, he was revolted and pushed for a law to enable federal inspection of meat processing. And that law is known as the Meat Inspection Law of 1906. And Upton Sinclair is quoted as saying, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach," because that's what people cared about was their food and not the terrible working conditions in the packing district. But this momentum then parlayed into the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which was also signed by President Theodore Roosevelt. This is the first law that empowered the federal government to regulate medical products. It empowered an existing agricultural agency, which then became the FDA, and it prohibited interstate commerce of misbranded and adulterated food, drinks, and drugs. So these are those key terms that I'd like everyone to pay attention to. So adulterated means impure, substituted with inferior components, filthy, or poisonous. And misbranded is false labeling, imitation, or inaccurate quantity. Importantly, though, this law did not require proof of safety or efficacy. It did not cover cosmetics. And ultimately, the law was not adequate to protect the public, and it has since been replaced by other laws. But these fundamental terms of adulteration and misbranding still remain in the regulatory lexicon today. So now let's move forward to about the 1930s. Dangerous products, unfortunately, still persisted on the market. That we have a very nascent regulatory framework that has a lot of holes in it. And an example of this is Lash Lure. It's a very early mascara product whose main ingredient was coal tar dye, which is now a known allergen. So for some people it was fine, but for other people, this mascara caused horrific blisters, abscesses, and ulcers on the face, eyelids, and eyes. And even a 52-year-old woman was blinded and subsequently died of a bacterial infection caused by those ulcers. Just horrible. Another example is the elixir of sulfanilamide. So sulfanilamide is a sulfonamide, which is a sulfur-based antibiotic that's actually quite effective. The drug itself is not particularly dangerous, but it was reformulated in diethylene glycol or antifreeze so that it could basically be a liquid drug and to make it easier for kids to ingest, because it's easier for kids to drink a liquid than take a pill. And because it was reformulated in antifreeze, over 100 people died who were mostly kids because of this reformulation that was not tested. And unfortunately, at the time, the regulatory framework could not have prevented these scandals, if you will, and a new law was created in response to public outrage. And this is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. This is also known as the FD&C Act. So this is one of those foundational laws to pay attention to. This was signed by Franklin Roosevelt in 1938, which replaced the 1906 law. And importantly, new drugs must show safety before they are marketed being sold. This is known as pre-market review. Drugs must also be labeled with adequate directions for safe use. Cosmetics and therapeutic devices are now under FDA control. And this law authorizes the FDA to inspect factories and authorizes court injunctions, seizures, and prosecutions. So you can see that now the regulatory framework is getting a little bit more robust and has now some teeth to go after people who are not following these laws. We also have some important additional laws and amendments as we move through time. The insulin amendment in 1941. So this was right as insulin was coming off of its patent, and insulin was being tested for purity and quality at the University of Toronto, I believe. And so insulin was about to be available for anyone to manufacture. And so this law was passed that requires anybody who produces it to certify its purity to continue to protect public health. The Public Health Service Act describes the licensing of biological products. And this is that second law that I would like everyone to remember. This is also known as PHS. Continuing to move through time, we can see that the laws are following the technology and the science of the time. We have the Penicillin Amendment, Durham-Humphrey Amendment, which just defines what a prescription drug is. And then in the 50s and 60s, we're starting to get more processed food and food with more bright colors and color additives and artificial flavors. And so we have the Food Additives Amendment and the Color Additive Amendment. Now we're in the 50s and 60s. And we are still sort of building this regulatory framework, unfortunately, in response to horrible scandals. I'm sure you guys have heard of thalidomide, which is actually quite an effective tranquilizer to treat anxiety, insomnia, and nausea. And it was used, I think it's still used actually for cancer patients in some cases. And it was so effective, people thought, let's give it to pregnant women who are experiencing morning sickness. But this was done without any prior testing in this population. Thalidomide was used in 46 countries, and as a result, over 10,000 children were born with phocomelia, which is this limb deformity condition. So the thalidomide actually affects the blood vessels in a fetus and therefore shortens their limbs. And only 17 of those babies were actually born in the United States for a very important reason. But in the United States, over 2.5 million tablets had been distributed to over 1,000 physicians during a clinical testing program that women at the time didn't actually know they were a part of. We didn't have informed consent at the time. But this woman, Frances Oldham Kelsey, was a reviewer at the FDA who refused to authorize the application for thalidomide because she had concerns about the lack of efficacy data for thalidomide in this population of pregnant women. And unfortunately, at the time, the regulatory framework could not have prevented this incident. But Kelsey was at least acknowledged for her efforts and received the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service in 1962. But very importantly, this directly inspired this Kefauver-Harris drug amendment. So prior to this, preclinical testing was not required for that specific indication. So now with this amendment, preclinical testing before clinical trial initiation is required. And this is for protection of patients. Substantial evidence of efficacy in well-controlled clinical trials, meaning more than one trial, is now required. And well-controlled meaning placebo-controlled, standard of care, some sort of comparator. Now, informed consent is required in clinical trials, which kind of blows my mind because it's such a foundational part of any clinical study that we know about, since we're undergraduates, but it was not required before this. And it is now required in this amendment because, as I said, the mothers that were given thalidomide were, in many cases, part of a clinical trial and they didn't even know it. Adverse event reporting is now required, and manufacturing standards and manufacturing inspections are put in place. And this became what we now know as good manufacturing practices. Pre-market approval is now required based on efficacy in that specific population for that indication and greater safety. So this is now a higher burden than pre-market review, where it was just you gave your data to the FDA and they had a chance to review it. Now this is an affirmative step of approval that the FDA must give you before you're allowed to proceed. Drug labels also now need to be approved by the FDA, and prescription drug advertisements must include fair balance of benefits and risks. So you can see that we're building out this regulatory framework, unfortunately, in a reactionary manner, but let's move a little bit more through time. We're now in the 80s, and we have the Tylenol murders of 1982, and unfortunately, many copycats after this. This is a fascinating and tragic case, and I think they actually don't know who the culprits are still to this day. But in the Chicago area, Tylenol capsules were laced with potassium cyanide and put on store shelves. 7 people died, and Johnson & Johnson, who manufactures Tylenol, was actually really proactive in recalling the product and going to the media to warn people. And this is actually a business case study about how well Tylenol handled it, or sorry, Johnson & Johnson handled it for Tylenol. But the investigation showed that the tampering with the Tylenol capsules occurred after the Tylenol was put into the stores and not during the manufacturing at Johnson & Johnson's facilities. So this inspired what is colloquially known as the Tylenol bill, which made tampering with products or falsely claiming to tamper or threatening to tamper with consumer products a federal offense. And then this was followed up in 1989 when the FDA established federal guidelines for tamper-proof packaging. And this is still very relevant today. I don't know if everyone remembers in 2019, this girl filmed herself on TikTok going into a Walmart in Lufkin, Texas, opening up containers of ice cream, licking them, closing them, and putting them back on the store shelves. Fortunately, they pretty quickly were able to identify the ice cream, destroy it, find her. But because of this Tylenol bill, the tamper-resistant packaging law, she was potentially prosecuted with a felony, 20 years in prison, and a $10,000 fine. At the time, she was a juvenile, so I can't find any information about what actually happened to her, but these are still very important laws to this day that we sort of take for granted when you have to peel the top off your Tylenol now. In 1992, we have the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. So while this is not a foundational law, it is a very important law in modernizing regulation. This law, PDUFA, authorizes the FDA to collect user fees from entities submitting drug applications for review. And this is very important because it plays a key role in keeping the time that the FDA reviews an application low. So, for example, if I'm Merck and I am submitting an application to the FDA for a new novel prescription drug, I have to pay a user fee to the FDA as part of my application. And that actually allows the FDA to hire the additional staff that they need to review the application in a timely manner. Also importantly, PDUFA has to be reauthorized every 5 years. And this is a very important step in shifting from reactionary regulation to being more proactive, because it gives the FDA the opportunity to include new legislation in a proactive manner to keep up with the pace of scientific innovation. And here are the examples of reauthorizations of PDUFA. I'm just going to very quickly go over some important notes for each one. So 1997, this is known as FDAMA. This allows dissemination of published data regarding off-label use of drugs and establishes a risk-based regulation scheme for medical devices. 2002, we have PDUFA 3. This establishes, importantly, goal review timelines for the FDA. So 10 months of review for a standard application or 6 months of review for a priority application, which really, really shortens the review timeline for the FDA. In 2007, we have FDA, which expanded clinical trial guidelines for pediatric drugs and created a priority review voucher program for orphan drugs. And this is really important because an orphan disease is a disease that affects fewer than 200,000 people. But for these people, the disease can be life-threatening. So this creates an incentive for sponsors to develop drugs for these orphan diseases. In 2012, we have FDASIA, which created a breakthrough therapy designation. This is a special designation that if you meet certain qualifications of your product being better than others or being a therapy where there aren't any, you get special privileges like a faster review, for example. In 2017, we have FDARA, which established rules for device inspections. 2022, PDUFA 7, new meeting types. This is really important also and relevant to a lot of us. It allows you to interact with the FDA if you have a very specific question about something, and that interaction is not covered by a new meeting type. So it gives you more access to the FDA, and it also sets performance goals for the various centers at the FDA. So hopefully, as you can see, we're starting to like plug in the holes here and be more proactive about fostering innovation. And so in 2002, we now have MDUFA, which is the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act. And this just reminds me of like going school shopping with my mom in middle school, where she's like, well, okay, that shirt fits you, and if you like it, let's buy one in every color. And so it feels very similar because PDUFA is successful and gives the FDA the ability to be proactive. And so now MDUFA is the same for medical devices where PDUFA was for drugs. So like I said, MDUFA similarly establishes user fees for device applications. And here you can see the reauthorizations of MDUFA. Sets performance goals for expedited applications, help for small businesses in terms of reduced costs. MDUFA 3 requires public reporting of performance goals and communication between the sponsor and the FDA to aid reviews. Guidance documents are developed. We'll talk about guidance documents in a couple slides. MDUFA 4 updated the user fees, risk-based classification of device accessories. MDUFA 5, we have updated user fees and some other administrative things. But you can see similarly, we're plugging holes where we need to in the regulatory framework, and we're becoming more proactive. And I think one of the best examples of proactive regulation is the 21st Century Cures Act, which was established in 2016. This was designed to help accelerate medical product development and bring new innovations and advances to patients who need them faster and more efficiently. This did some key things like modernize clinical trial designs, including the use of real-world evidence. So if you have a drug, for example, that's being used for indication A, but it is also being used off-label by doctors legally for a separate indication, now sponsors can submit data to the FDA that is collected from, for example, electronic medical records of the use of this drug in a different indication to support the official authorization of that indication for that drug. It also establishes the Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy designation and the Breakthrough Devices program. So those two are special designations where, similarly to what I mentioned before, if you have a product that meets certain criteria of being very, very important and potentially life-saving or making a therapy available where there isn't one, you get special privileges from the FDA, such as a faster review of your product. But this really helps modernize the modern medical product regulation and really tries to keep up with the fast pace of innovation. We have a lot of new technologies like CAR T cell therapy and engineered tissues and some really advanced devices that we're starting to move very, very quickly in terms of innovation. And the FDA has to be very proactive in keeping up with those things. So we've talked a lot about laws. We have maybe mentioned regulations, and I have mentioned guidance documents. So let's just make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what these things are. So on one side of the spectrum, we have policies. And these are plans or principles that guide decision making, but they don't have any consequences to not following them. So, for example, Home Depot has a policy of employees being friendly to customers. Totally. But there's no consequences to not following that. On the other side of the spectrum is a law, which is a statute, act, and rule established by a governing authority, i.e. our government, which are enforceable by that authority. And these have legal consequences in the courts for not following the laws. Regulations, because laws are not super specific, regulations operationalize the law. They provide details because the laws aren't that specific. And a regulation must always be referenced back to a law so that breaking the regulation equates to breaking the law. So a very simple example of this is a law would be drive safely in a school zone. Okay, how do we do that? And then the regulation associated with that law maybe says drive less than 25 miles per hour in a school zone. So you have that specificity that's linked back to the law, and then breaking the regulation equals breaking the law. And then sort of under regulations are guidance documents. These are not legally binding, but they are a snapshot of the FDA's current thinking on a particular matter. And these are very helpful because they tell you how to actually put the regulations into practice, and they indicate how the FDA will review your data based on its current thinking. And also importantly, industry and experts outside of the FDA can contribute to writing these guidance documents. So typically, the FDA will write a draft guidance document, publish it freely and publicly, and then have a comment period. So anybody that the document is relevant to can read it and give their feedback to the FDA on this document. And then the FDA will take those comments into consideration and issue a final guidance document. And these documents, there are hundreds, probably even thousands of them, and they cover very specific topics from what you should include in a clinical trial application for cartilage repair products for the knee. And then you have some more general ones like manufacturing considerations for cell-based products. But these are really, really helpful and really important for biomedical engineers like us to determine what the FDA wants to see in our studies. And hopefully I've convinced you by now that regulation is still something that we should care about today. So in 2019, I listened to a podcast from the Wondery called Bad Batch, and I was just fascinated because this was about the time that I was getting going in my master's in regulatory science. And so I actually knew what this podcast was talking about. The show focuses on a stem cell company called Livion, which is located in Orange County, actually where I am. And this company used allogeneic umbilical cord stem cells that they had processed at Genentech. Genentech basically served as a contract manufacturer for them. And then they were selling these stem cells for orthopedic applications. These were injected into joints by various people, including chiropractors. And, I'm not disparaging chiropractors. I think they're great and they have an important role, but generally they're not trained or qualified to be giving intra-articular injections. And ultimately, 17 people were hospitalized in 5 states from bacterial contamination, and 2 of those people died. And then we start playing the blame game, where Levion claimed the cells are not a drug and they did not require pre-market approval, which is absolutely and entirely wrong. And hopefully in session 2, you will understand why based on the regulation of cell and tissue products. And then they blame Genentech for their poor manufacturing. And then they blame the doctors for not administering the stem cells correctly. But ultimately, stem cells in any form are a drug that requires pre-market approval prior to selling the product. Livion was cited by the FDA for insufficient practices related to donor screening, aseptic practices, environmental monitoring, batch release criteria, and complaint handling. So, 2019 wasn't that far away, and these are still regulatory issues are still popping up that we have to tamp down as we go throughout time. So, in summary of this story time, which I hope you have enjoyed, we have our fundamental terms for medical product regulation. Those are adulterated, meaning impure, filthy, and poisonous, and misbranded, being false labeling, imitation, or inaccurate quantity. We have our laws versus regulations versus guidance documents. So laws are enforceable by courts, regulations operationalize the laws, and guidance documents are not legally binding, but they tell you how the FDA currently wants you to enact those regulations. We have our foundational laws that empower the FDA, and those are the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 and the Public Health Service Act of 1944. And then we have our shift in regulatory philosophy. And hopefully that has been pretty clear to you throughout the presentation. A really good example of this specifically is the Kefauver-Harris drug amendment, which was in direct response to the thalidomide scandal of the 50s and 60s that modernized clinical trials. In contrast to the 21st Century Cures Act, where the FDA is actively trying to balance keeping the guardrails on regulation, but allowing super innovative products to reach the people who need them faster. And ultimately, hopefully I have convinced you that medical product regulation is something that we should always care about and always be proactive with, because history has shown us what can happen when we don't have those guardrails or we're not being proactive about staying in that center lane. So with that, I will conclude and take any questions, and then just want to let everyone know that part 2 of this certificate is going to be Friday, October 10th at the in-person BMES meeting from 3 to 4:30, and that will be Fundamentals and Perspectives in Medical Product Regulation for Biomedical Engineers. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Brown. And thanks for the reminder of the workshop time and date at the annual meeting and for walking us through the history of regulations and how we got to where we are today. And like Dr. Brown said, we're going to open it up to questions. So as we're going, if you have additional questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. So the first question we have is, I'm just going to read the beginning of it and the question that's at the end there. Regulations for products during pregnancy and breastfeeding is a really interesting topic. It seems like clinicians just tell women not to take anything because there aren't good studies on drugs during breastfeeding and pregnancy. For example, RA patients aren't supposed to take biological drugs during breastfeeding, despite the fact that women with RA tend to have serious flares postpartum. What's the current thinking about regulating products and making them available for use during pregnancy and breastfeeding?
Yeah, that's a very important topic. Generally, like throughout the history of clinical trials, the philosophy has been that like pregnant women are a high risk population. If something goes wrong or they experience toxicities, it is high risk to expose a fetus to something that is new and untested. So unfortunately, that has led to trials not being performed in pregnant women because they are high risk. And it's, I mean, as you very eloquently stated, very important because pregnant women also have health conditions that need to be addressed. But it's unfortunately sort of this balancing act of protecting a more high risk population and then also involving them in clinical trials so that they can have access to these very important medications. And I would say that people are aware of this problem. I'm not sure that there's certainly not a solution yet, but perhaps as drugs and biological therapies, as you mentioned, are more well established, more well understood, have a longer history of safety, people will start to entertain indications for pregnant women because they'll be more confident in the longer term safety profile of some of these medications. But it is a very important problem. I agree.
Thank you. Does anyone have any additional questions? Anything else to ask Dr. Brown? Or would you like to share anything? Do you want to share anything about the upcoming workshop
Sure.
also?
Yeah. So at the in-person workshop, it's going to be basically two parts. The first part is going to be the specifics of how medical products are regulated, drugs, devices, and biologics. Those are the categories that we deal with. It's not going to cover food, cosmetics, or, for example, over-the-counter drugs. They're extremely relevant, but they're just not typically the things that we in biomedical engineering create. Um, you're going to see how there is a risk-based regulation to these things. So, for example, a Band-Aid is not regulated to the same degree as a TMJ jaw prosthesis. Um, and you're going to learn about the types of applications, the burden of proof that you have to show. And then the second part of the session will be a panel discussion with experts from academia and industry who have gone through various aspects of this regulatory process to get their products from research to clinical trials, their direct experience with interactions with regulatory authorities, and how basically people in academia view regulation versus how people in industry view regulation. So hopefully that will be another really interesting session, certainly the panel discussion, but I think we all have the background now, the context to understand why we have this framework and why we have a risk-based approach to regulating these things.
We do have another question that came in about how does FDA deal with questions such as particular ingredients being banned in Europe because of their potential health hazards, but still being used in the US?
Yeah, another really relevant question. So I wouldn't, ingredients that are banned in Europe and used here, it's not like we are using all of the ingredients that are banned in Europe. It's sort of a Venn diagram where we just have different regulatory approaches, and one is not better than the other. So, for example, we have banned ingredients here that are used in Europe, and Europe has banned ingredients there that we use here. We certainly have overlapping ingredients that are generally safe for use, and we have ingredients that are also banned in both places. It's just a different regulatory approach, but I would not say that Europe is stricter or that we're stricter. It's just different. But for example, all of the major colors that we use are also allowed in Europe. But it is, I mean, it's a hot topic right now for sure.
Thank you for your question. Is there anybody have additional questions they want to ask? It's very comprehensive. And then I think everybody's looking forward. Oh, here we go. Sorry, one more question. Um, how are these regulations formulated differently when the uses are the same?
Um,
More clarification.
Yeah. Do you
Yes.
mind adding more clarification, whoever wrote that?
Yeah,
Oops.
that's pertaining to the previous question.
The previous being food additives. I'm sorry, I still don't understand your question, but I'm going to take a stab at answering. So I think what you mean is like just uses are the same. So let's just use a very simple example of like red dye or something. Maybe there are two red dyes that are both used in candy. Um, and one of them is banned here and the other one is banned in Europe, but they're both used to make Skittles. It's just a difference in perhaps regulatory philosophy or priorities for that population, that country's population. Um, Maybe it's based on research that was done in that particular country. An interesting example, sort of an extension of this, is in Japan. Their population is so homogeneous that even if you have an approved drug in the United States, Europe, Australia, it's approved in those countries. Japan still requires you to do a phase 3 clinical trial in a 100% Japanese population in Japan before that they will authorize your product. Even if you do a study that includes Japanese Americans, for example, they still want a local Japanese phase 3 pivotal trial because they know that the Japanese population typically responds differently physiologically to medications than Westerners for some reason. But they're aware and they have a more conservative approach to protect the public health of their country.
We have another question about, can clinical data from other countries be used as the use of real world evidence to avoid clinical testings in the States?
Yeah. So I would not say avoid, um, but yes. So something else that we're going to talk about at the in-person meeting. It's called GXPs, X being fill in the blank. GMP is good manufacturing practice. GCP is good clinical practice. And so these are standards by which you perform manufacturing or clinical trials or donor screening or anything related to a product that are harmonized. They are accepted more and more by more countries in the world. So the United States and Europe, certainly Japan, Australia, they're all trying to make basically the requirements and the standards for a lot of these things the same so that, as you said, a clinical trial performed in Europe done under good clinical practices, good manufacturing practices that has high data integrity, that data can be reviewed also by the FDA to support a marketing application in the United States. So I wouldn't say avoid, but augment. Um, yes, there's a movement toward harmonization for a lot of these things. That's a great question.
Thank you. I don't see any additional questions, so I appreciate the time. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for providing all this information, answering the questions. Thank you, everybody, for their questions. We will, as Dr. Brown had mentioned, the workshop is on Friday the 10th at the BMES annual meeting in San Diego. This concludes our webinar. Thanks everybody for joining us today. And we just want to remind you that the webinar is being recorded. So we will provide that additional information on the recording. We'll post it to the BMES website when it's available. And when it is available, we'll notify everybody through email to let them know that how you all can access the archive recording. So we look forward to seeing everybody at the workshop in a very short time, less than a month. And if you want to learn more about additional information, upcoming activities and events at BMES, you can visit www.bmes.org. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you all.